Alright, everyone. Hello, and welcome to a special Monday-ish edition of the 411 Ground and Pound MMA podcast. I am Robert Winfrey. I am your host. This was going to be done yesterday, but so I suppose we should start on the. This is coming out a day late because of some news that broke Sunday. There was news going to be breaking on Monday, and I figured, all right, I'll put it off for a day to listen to that so I can be fully informed when I talk about what we're going to talk about. First up, which will be the UFC 249 situation and its status, so we'll get into some of that. There was no show last week because the only thing to talk about would have been Jon Jones, and maybe we could have done something with that, but now we have more information than we did then, so I don't feel badly about taking a week off. In lieu of the normal show, I did release, I'll get this plug out of the way, a kind of skill study and career retrospective on Dominic Cruz that I had a lot of fun doing. So hopefully, if you are listening to this, find that and give it a listen. I would appreciate it. I put a fair amount of time and energy into those things, so please. And give me feedback if you're so inclined. I've got another one coming that was requested, one on Shogun, that should be coming out in the next couple of weeks. I'm just kind of trying to keep myself busy. So be on the lookout for that. If you have a, fighter you'd like to hear a retrospective skills study kind of thing looked at, let me know. You can find me on Twitter at WinfreyMMA, and I would be happy to field requests in that respect. That's kind of the intro for the moment, so let's go ahead and get to the, I suppose meat and potatoes is about as good a descriptor as anything. UFC 249, we do have an update on this event. Last week, in fact, just about the day after I recorded the show, Khabib Nurmagomedov officially announced he didn't say I'm definitely out, but he did say, I'm in Russia, there's travel restrictions in place, I'm still willing to fight if there's a location, but there isn't, and it just doesn't seem like this is very viable. Khabib did a full interview with Brett Okamoto that you can find on YouTube, which I highly recommend. Khabib talks about a lot of the situation that he was dealing with. I mean, the basic kind of breakdown is he was in California at AKA, and AKA was essentially shut down, apart from a couple of hours a day when Khabib was training. California went into a pretty serious lockdown situation, and he could no longer get the kind of training that he wanted. So he went back to Russia, where he could train and be with his family during the midst of, a global pandemic. I mean, for crying out loud, if all he had said was, given the state of the world, I'm not comfortable fighting, I want to be with my family right now, no one in the world should have had anything negative to say about it. But he had plenty of reasons. Again, I'm not sure how confirmed this is, but there's kind of a bit that floated around that the UFC told him that 249 was something like 99% going to be taking place in the United Arab Emirates. So he and his team kind of tried to get down there, and no, the UAE had actually closed the borders to all non-citizens. And there's a travel ban right now on Russia, so. And one of the things that really annoys me that has kind of come out lately is this cadre of morons that think Khabib is running from Tony Ferguson or this fight. That is, I'm just gonna very briefly. That is a ridiculous, absurd, out of touch with reality claim. If Khabib were afraid of Tony or running from this fight, he would never have signed to begin with. Yet he has. 5 times. You're talking about a man who comes from one of the most war-torn, unstable places in the world, fights for a living, is undefeated in his career, is the undisputed UFC lightweight champion, bear in mind, the most difficult division to succeed in the sport. And you're going to accuse this guy of running? It's ridiculous. That is absolutely ridiculous. He's no more running than Tony was running when he got blood in his lungs or blew out his knee. There's a global pandemic, guys. You want to know why this fight isn't happening? Why we're not getting Tony Khabib? We're not getting Tony Khabib because there's a global pandemic. Period. Full stop. End of discussion. That's it. If the world were operating normally, we'd get Tony versus Khabib on the 18th. There's nothing stopping it apart from, the world shutting down. And, again, blaming Khabib for this is utter nonsense. Claims that he is running, utter nonsense. And to, again, any of the morons out there going, well, isn't he friends with Putin? No, he's not friends with Vladimir Putin. They've met a couple of times because he is a prominent sportsman. The notion that he could just call up a world leader in the midst of what is probably the preeminent global crisis of the last 100 years. Hang on, let me do some math on that real quick. Okay, not quite not the preeminent global crisis of the last 100 years, because that would go back to 1920, at which point we were dealing with the aftermath of World War I. So, at a minimum of the last, probably, because there were some dicey political moments during the Cold War, but that was hardly a giant global. That wasn't this, The ability of someone to travel, to get an exemption to travel in and out of the country is so far down the list of priorities that any world leader is dealing with right now. It's ridiculous. Bear in mind, I am not the president of the Russian Federation. If I were in that position, I wouldn't even take the call from someone like Khabib. I've got so many other things to worry about. This is not a circumstance that you can just call up someone, get an exemption, fly you and your team. I'm going to get to the rest of this in a minute, but so again, Khabib kind of cleared the air. This is unfortunate. Setting aside the, tragedy of a global pandemic that is claiming thousands of lives. Ramadan starts very shortly, and Khabib won't be able to train or fight during that because he observes. His public stance was push the fight with Tony to August or September, and let's do it then, which was what I thought should happen. Again, sadly, not what we got, but we will get to that in just a minute or two. But I want to do this a little bit chronologically. So Khabib said it's just not feasible for me to fight right now. That's unfortunate. The UFC continues to say that 249 will go on. I don't like what they've concocted here. So the UFC came out today, said they have signed Tony Ferguson versus Justin Gaethje for the interim lightweight title. Okay, I've said on this program before in the past, if we never get Tony versus Gaethje, it will be a crying shame, because those two violent... I hesitate to find another adjective. Those two violent human beings, violent maniacs, squaring off inside the cage is, very nearly can't-miss fighting action. But nothing happens in a vacuum. And we have to consider the totality of circumstance here. One, I'm going to put on my tinfoil hat here for just a second. So, this is not extreme, so bear with me. I think the UFC is trying to screw Tony. And in kind of a roundabout way. First of all, let's actually assume the fight happens. I'm not so sure it will anyway, but let's assume it does. Those two, the way they fight, they're going to take a giant physical toll on each other. Now, first of all, Tony might lose that fight. I'm picking Tony Ferguson. Let me be very, very clear about this. I favor Tony quite heavily. But are you going to be surprised if Gaethje wins? because I'm not. I mean, look, Tony Ferguson, God bless him, the man's almost 37 years old. I mean, he's older than I am. Okay, sorry, he just turned 30. He just turned 36 in February. Still, nearly 40. At lightweight. That bill comes due. And he's taken a fair bit of damage in his career. I mean, I don't know. I know a lot of you may not remember this, but the Barboza fight was kind of wild before he won. Lando Venata kicked him in the head and nearly finished him. Kevin Lee put a beating on him in the first round and a half or so of their fight. Tony has taken some damage and is getting up there in age. Now, I'm not saying he's going to, I'm not picking against him here. I'm not. I picked Tony against the division. Except for maybe Khabib, and even then I'm not sure who I pick in that fight. But if you look at, say, the top of lightweight, let's take the top, 5 guys. In whatever order you want to place them, you've got, what, Khabib, Tony, Poirier, Conor, and who's the last one, actually, that would fall in that list? Fire up the old rankings here. Who's number 5 at the moment? Hooker. Okay. So, Khabib, Tony, Poirier, Conor, Gaethje, and Hooker are your top 6. That's champion and the top 5 contenders. Is anyone surprised if any of those guys beat each other? You could match up anyone in that group, and are you surprised if somebody wins? Look, say you do Khabib-Conor rematch, which is what the UFC is trying to get to. I pick Khabib. Heavily. Would I be shocked if Conor found a way to win? No. Take Tony and Conor. I picked Tony. Would I be shocked if Conor stopped him, given how kind of wild Tony is? No. Let's say you do a Poirier... Say you do a Poirier-McGregor rematch. I mean, McGregor stopped Poirier at featherweight a few years ago. Say you do the rematch at lightweight. Anybody shocked if Conor repeats? Anybody shocked if Poirier gets revenge? I mean, let's throw Gaethje into the mix. You do the rematch between Gaethje and Poirier. I mean, they had a great fight the first time, and in the interim, since then, Gaethje has kind of refined a lot of his style. He's not the same guy now that he was when they first fought. Gonna be shocked if Gaethje pulls it off this time? Or would you be shocked if Poirier beat him again? There is no shock in any of those fights. There might be a shock in methodology. Okay, if Conor submits Khabib, that would be genuinely shocking, right? But if Conor just found a way to win that fight, are you really shocked? Not really. They're all exceptional. So, let's start with Tony might lose, right? Let's just start there. He might. I don't think he will, but let's not pretend that's not a possibility. He might lose. Second, even if he wins, which I would favor him to win, if he wins, you don't beat Justin Gaethje unscathed. I mean, look at what happened. He and Eddie Alvarez beat the crap out of each other. Look at Dustin Poirier. He tore Dustin Poirier's, was it his quad or his hamstring? I can't remember which one it was. I think it was his quad. He tore Poirier's quad with leg kicks. And Poirier beat him. These two are going to exact an unbelievable physical toll from each other, unless we get a very quick knockout. And history does not indicate that will be the case. If you want to beat either of these guys, you got to go to war. Point being, even if Tony wins, I'm fairly sure the UFC is going to try and hotshot McGregor versus Khabib. I think they will use kind of the excuse of Tony's recovery to circumvent his title shot again. And I am not happy about that. At all. I think even if Tony wins, unless he gets a quick finish and comes out of this fight unscathed, the UFC is going to keep him on the shelf. And to be fair, he might need to be on the shelf, okay? That's kind of the other thing here. If he goes through hell, and if he comes out on the other side, but if he's got to take, say, 4 to 6 months to recover, if he's not ready to go in, August or September, you think the UFC is going to go, you know what, no, we'll just wait? No, they're going to try to do Conor Khabib 2 because that's the biggest money fight. And I don't want that. I want Tony versus Khabib. Straight up, plain and simple. No frills, no BS. That's what I want. And my slightly tinfoil hat theory is if Tony loses, if Tony loses, which I don't expect, but again, he might. We lose Tony versus Khabib. Straight up. I don't think that they might get back to it. Like Tony might lose this fight, go on, win another couple, and we kind of, sort of reconvene. But it won't be what it was. The big drawing point for this fight right now is not just how good these two guys are. It's their streaks. These two are on unprecedented winning streaks in the deepest division the sport has to offer. And these two are beating everybody. And again, you hate to say that if, Tony loses this fight, it's just done for. I don't think his career is over. He could rebound, get back to the title. But you do kind of lose Tony versus Khabib. And it would just be, for that fight to have fallen apart through circumstances both within the control of the parties and without. Look, Khabib screwing up his weight cut that one time, that's on him. Tony deciding it's a good idea to wear sunglasses indoors, tripping over television cables and blowing out his knee, that's on him. Khabib getting injured, okay, injuries happen, it sucks. Tony having whatever that injury or issue was with his lungs, injuries happen, that sucks. It's kind of out of your control in a very real way. And now, global pandemic. But if Tony loses, and we just straight up lose that fight, and never really get it back, that would just be unbelievably on brand for the UFC, wouldn't it? For all the BS they spew about we make the fights people want to make, I shouldn't say it's total BS, it's not. They do a really good job the majority of the time putting together the fights the public is interested in. That's very true. But think about the big ones that got away from them. There's some of the really big fights that the UFC was never able to put together. And if we lose this one, based on nothing more than the stubbornness of the UFC to put on an event in contravention of all available information about how to handle ourselves during this particular pandemic, again, that would be one of the most UFC things they could possibly do. Ugh. I may have just talked myself into thinking that's what's going to happen. Look, I still don't think the event's going to happen. But we'll get to that in a second. So, again, officially right now, Gaethje versus Ferguson for the interim lightweight belt is your main event. Your co-main, I think the rest of the card still kind of remains. Your co-main event is supposed to be Andrade, the rematch between Jessica Andrade and Rose Namajunas. I don't think Andrade is in the country, and I'm not sure if Brazil is letting people travel out right now, but hey. A light heavyweight fight between Magomed Ankalaev and Ion Cutelaba is still on the books. I'm not sure how accurate that is. If Ankalaev is in, Russia right now somewhere, or I don't know where Cutelaba trains out of, But there's a real chance those guys can't get out of their respective countries. Yeah, Islam Makhachev, this card is not going to look like this. There's so many people on this card that are, if they're not already in the United States right now, are probably not going to be able to get here. So I can't really speak to the rest of this card because, I mean, especially when we get further down onto the preliminary portions of it, you have Makhmud Muradov, Umar Nurmagomedov, Otman Izatar. I mean, to be clear, this is not a knock on those fights or those fighters, but depending on their location, their physical locations right now, there's a real chance they're not able to get to wherever this event is going to be held. So anyway, we officially do sort of have a main event. Here's what we don't have: a venue. It's kind of being reported that the UFC is looking at somewhere on the West Coast. Now, if that's the case, there is no way this is going to be a properly sanctioned event. California, if we're talking about the United States, right? There are only 3 states on the West Coast. There's California, Oregon, and Washington. Washington is basically the epicenter of it's where the coronavirus is currently doing the most damage if we're talking about the West Coast. California has currently suspended all combat sports licenses through the end of May. So they're just not going to sanction it. And, I mean, there was supposed to be a UFC event in Oregon, right? Hang on, I want to make sure, because I'm pretty sure. Yeah, there was supposed to be an event this coming Saturday, the 11th, in Portland, Oregon. That was canceled because of the safety precautions being taken over the pandemic. So there's no way that in 2 weeks, a little bit less, Oregon's going to suddenly change their mind. So we are not talking about an event that will be properly sanctioned by a governing body. If the UFC is going to do this, they're going to have to literally leave the country. They're going to have to find some kind of Native American reservation and put it on there. And I know the UFC has self-regulated in the past, and even the very recent past, they go to certain locations that just don't have governing bodies. To be fair, in that respect, it's not like this is totally unprecedented, even in the more recent history of the promotion. They do that when they are essentially required to out of necessity based on the location they are operating in. This is the first time they are actively running away from essentially state oversight. And gotta be honest, I don't like it. I think that relative to, 7 days ago, how likely is it that this event goes off now versus then? I think in some respects it's more likely. On the other hand, if we're going to have this conversation, let's have this conversation. How are they going to guarantee the safety of all parties concerned? I mean, look, that's the big one, right? I could talk about how fighters are not able to train properly right now. Pretty much every MMA gym is shut down. Right? No one's getting proper training. No one. So let's start with that. But I'm prepared to accept that there's a bigger concern than this fight's happening under less than ideal circumstances. I mean, Gaethje's taken this fight on 2 weeks' notice. That's absurd. That's just crazy. I don't know what was done to kind of sweeten the metaphorical pot for him, but I know they offered him a short notice fight against Tony in the past, and he turned it down because the time frame, which I believe was 4 weeks, wasn't adequate to prepare to fight, a month. Tony Ferguson is the butcher of that division, right? He cuts you to pieces. And he said, I'm not afraid to fight Tony Ferguson, but I need more than 4 weeks to prepare for that monster. It's perfectly reasonable. So him taking this on 2 weeks, I don't know. I don't know what they did, but they got him to sign. Anyway, the big thing, again, how are we guaranteeing safety, right? We're talking about a bunch of people who are going to be traveling some significant distances. I mean, Gagey lives and trains in Colorado. That's the distance he's going to be traveling and the people he'll be encountering, that's a non-trivial risk. There's all the people involved. There's going to be Gagey and his training team and his cornermen and whatever other entourage he's going to be bringing along. Ditto Tony. Ditto everybody else on the card. So, how are you going to be able to secure COVID testing? If you can, how often are you going to be testing? Because this is a disease that we're still learning about in a lot of ways, and people can be not only asymptomatic but still contagious, but you can be negative one day and positive the next, and we're talking about people who are going to be coming into contact with a lot of different people. What's your housing situation going to be like? You going to put them up in a hotel? What kind of controls are in place for the personnel they're encountering in the hospitality industry? What kind of controls do you have for not just the fighters? How about the UFC employees? How about the production staff, the cameramen, the ring crew? Are we, again, what allowances are we making for their safety? Are we testing everyone involved? Because you should be. Moreover, testing itself is not this notion that, okay, sorry, before I move on. If you have secured that kind of testing, how responsible is it to allocate the resources necessary to properly test for this to a superfluous athletic event when they should be going to much more necessary centers of incident? There's plenty of places that need proper COVID tests a hell of a lot more than the UFC needs to put on this event. Again, and I know, this is combat sports, this is the fight game. The entire ethics of it are a little bit murky to begin with. Fair enough, but really, that's a pretty big question that I think they will need to have an answer for in some respect. Here's the other deal. What happens if someone tests positive? You have a lot of people dealing with each other at these events, unless the UFC does a complete overhaul of everything they do, not just everything they do, but how they do it ahead of these events. If one fighter, or one person in their entourage, or one UFC employee tests positive, there's a very real chance they've already spread it to a bunch of other people. The likelihood of you catching this at the incident of infection is so small. So there's already going to be a period of time where other people have been exposed. What are you going to do about that? What if somebody tests positive on, I don't know what the full card is going to be, but let's assume the Andrade Namajunas card, or fight stays on this card, and both of those fighters in their respective camps are present. And Namajunas, I think, trains at Elevation where Gagey trains. So let's assume that those fights are there. If someone on Andrade's team tests positive, and Namajunas decides, nope, I'm out, what are you going to do? I know what you're going to do, UFC. You're going to throw her under the bus. Because that's what you always do in circumstances like this. To anyone who doesn't subscribe to the professional ethics of convenience for the promotion. Again, what are you going to do if an employee tests positive? And, a bunch of fighters wind up saying, you know what, I don't feel comfortable with this, I'm out. And that's just from a logistical perspective about the event. Do you know what you have to do to treat someone who tests positive for this? You actually need like a triage center set up. Are you going to have that? You're going to have a bunch of people at this event, UFC, even if you have the bare minimum. I've talked a little bit about this in the past. what's the bare minimum for the UFC to put on an event, right? We're talking personnel here. You have 12 or 13 fights, so 24 to 26 fighters. Each fighter's going to have 3 to 4 cornermen. And let's assume a little bit of overlap on a few of them. So because again, sometimes you have, similar camps, the same camp will have multiple fighters. So there might be a little bit of overlap, but you're still dealing with a lot of people, with a lot of that. That's just for them. You need the judges, right? How about medical personnel? Here's a big question for you guys, because remember, we're 2 weeks out from this. We have not yet, based on all available projections, hit the peak of impact that this virus is going to have here in the United States. I think the more reasonable projections are, again, this month at some point. So we might be dealing with peak outbreak. You're going to take medical personnel, because there's a couple of doctors that have to be, hey, maybe the UFC just doesn't give a crap, and we'll have an event without, medical personnel on standby. Get somebody killed, and the UFC will just blithely go back to, well, we're in compliance when we're dealing with state governments, and no one. The UFC could actually do that. Let me be very clear about this. This is how little I think of the majority of media in this sport and what the promotion would do. If this event goes off, if there's insufficient medical personnel present due to the overwhelming demand of dealing with the COVID outbreak, if somebody dies, there's no way the UFC will be held properly accountable for this. None. Absolutely none. They will continue on with business as usual, essentially. The media will maybe have a week's worth of content about it. There is no way, almost no way, that they would be properly held accountable for those actions. Dana would come out with some half-assed, it's tragic, but it's the fight game and these things happen. It's not the first time somebody's died in a cage or died in a ring. And we're going to push on because they were warriors and that's what they would have wanted. I would bet so much money on that. So much money. So, point actually being, you're going to take medical personnel, doctors, away from that. You need an ambulance. I mean, you probably will not need one by law, depending on where they go. But if they hold an event that genuinely doesn't even have, emergency personnel on standby, oh my. And you're going to have, okay, you're going to tell me that you're going to have a main event for this event that is Tony Ferguson and Justin Gaethje. One of those two, if not both of them, is going to go to the hospital when this is done. Speaking of which, how well is the local medical facilities dealing with the COVID outbreak? You're going to take fighters who just beat the hell out of each other, possibly concussed, possibly with other serious injuries, certainly with cuts, lacerations, concussions, some kind of concussive damage to the head, even if we're talking about, subconcussive force multiple times. You have to take them to a hospital that is then probably at least partially overwhelmed or at least swamped with cases of the coronavirus. What if they get sick there? How's your legal liability in that situation? I would sue their ass off. Ugh. So there's that. Again, you need, from a matter of ethics, at a bare minimum, you need competent medical personnel on site and the ability to transport fighters to medical facilities in the event of an emergency. At a bare minimum, this is the bare bones minimum ethical requirements to have a combat sports event. My opinion. And since we're talking about ethics, I think this is the only way to do it because you have to extrapolate that scale. And you're going to be taking those people away from dealing with, again, the first genuine global pandemic in 100 years. Probably about 100 years, actually, if we go back to the Spanish flu, which was the 1920s. So right about 100 years. I'll say 100 to round up, just for rounding sake. You're going to take necessary medical personnel away from that to do this. Because why exactly? That's the... so again, we got issues with so much of this. Here's a better question. Why is the UFC so doggedly insisting on this event going forward? Because I don't have an answer. There's speculation. There's speculation that there's some pressure being put on by Endeavor, the parent company of the UFC, because Endeavor's a little strapped for cash. There's a serious question about how much of the UFC's cash reserves might have been depleted by that $300 million dividend payout they took out, which is largely speculated to be cover for the failed IPO of Endeavor as a parent company that they tried. So there might be some financial pressure being put on there. There might be some language there might be some contractual language that the UFC could be taking a pretty serious financial hit if they don't produce X amount of content. I don't know that to be true. I don't know that to be true. I'm speculating. This might just be Dana's ego. You told me I can't. Everyone's telling me I can't now. So, boy, I'm just going to plow forward, and the real-world consequences be damned. I don't know, guys. I mean, look, if you told me that we're getting Tony Ferguson and Justin Gaethje, again, fight in a vacuum, how could anyone be opposed to that fight in a vacuum? That is such a great fight. You have two unbelievably credentialed fighters, two violence machines that are going to clash. I mean, who could be against that under ideal circumstances? But we're not under ideal circumstances. We're not even close. We are unbelievably away from normal. Right? I'm not necessarily one of the people who believe that this will have a giant that the pandemic will have this giant transformative effect on life. Maybe I'm wrong. Okay? I'm not an expert. I'm so far from an expert. But I'm not sure I believe fully that this is going to change everything. There's a lot of people that are going to lose a lot. In terms of livelihood, in terms of lives, in terms of... This is a terrible thing. It really, really sucks. I don't have to... That should go without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. But I know there's been a bunch of people who tend to be of the... This is going to change everything, and I'm not sure I buy that. But at a bare minimum, I think we can all come together on this following point right now. I'm recording this April 6th. And almost certainly on April 18th, barring a miracle, which you can't plan for, it will be worse. Right? That is, again, all available projections. This is going to get worse by the time April 18th comes around. So, again, barring a miracle, at a bare minimum, we are not operating at normal right now. Can we all... I mean, come on. This is an indisputable fact. Can we all at least agree on that? And I'd love to say that with any degree of certainty, but there's giant segments of the population that don't believe the Earth is flat or that vaccines are a good idea. So I'm not going to take this for granted. But we're not normal right now, guys. And we can't pretend that that's not the case. I'm going to maintain this position until unless something external changes the circumstance. This entire event should not happen. It just shouldn't. And I know it sucks. I really know it sucks. But I think there are just too many real-world concerns right now. And I know there's a segment of the fandom that's like, well, or there's a school of thought, rather, that this is the time when we should be trying to return to normalcy and yada, yada, yada. And spare me. Just please spare me that nonsense. All right? Let's assume this event goes off. Let's assume, okay? Sake of argument. You've now thrown how many people, again, into this particular circumstance that have had to travel, some of them, at a bare minimum, most of them across state borders in the United States, a bunch of them probably internationally. I mean, there's fighters right now that are currently stranded in the United States. I think Marvin Vettori is stranded here. Dude lives and trains in Italy, which is thankfully, again, based on current modeling on the downside of its dealing with the outbreak. But he flew here when the UFC said we're going to have, because he was supposed to fight at the London card, and the UFC said, no, it'll be here in the States, fly here. He flew here, and he's stranded. Freaking stranded. Literally can't go home. Because the country's locked down. Not just ours, his. So you're going to bring a bunch of people here, some of them internationally. You're going to try to house them in some capacity. You're going to be dealing with the hospitality industry. You're going to be dealing with interfering with other people. You're then going to try to hold an event where you cram the fighters, their cornermen, judges, whatever sort of official oversight is going to be there. Because there's going to be there will be somebody, even if it's just, the UFC trotting out Mark Ratner. There's going to be somebody there to help make sure things go smoothly from a regulatory standpoint, even if it's self-regulatory. The referees. I mean, who's to say... we are now also, by the way, we're not able to even remotely validate the competency of the officials involved. Now, combat sports judging being what it is, and I've yelled about that plenty, now we're going to remove even the limited safeguards of, having to be sanctioned by a commission. Who's gonna verify who's gonna vouch for these people's competency? Who's gonna pay them? Is the UFC gonna pay them? If the UFC's paying the judges, boy, do we have a giant conflict of interest there, don't we? Seriously. Giant conflict of interest. Even if it doesn't, and to be clear, I know there's a bunch of people who don't necessarily understand what that means. Even if the conflict does not necessarily manifest, that doesn't mean it isn't there. It is absolutely there. If the UFC is paying the judges to render decisions about fights, there is a giant conflict of interest there for a promotion to do that. Giant. And I really shouldn't even have to spell that out, but hey. And then there's the medical personnel, who we're going to be taking away from much more necessary circumstances for what is a luxury. This is another thing, fighting, any sort of athletic activity, any sort of sport, at a professional level, for a consumer audience, is a luxury item. And I know a lot of the fighters don't feel that way. It's their job, and I get that. I really do, and I think Luke Thomas has a video out right now that fighters should look into, given how much of the stimulus package independent contractors in their position are entitled to. On the off chance anyone listening to this is a fighter or knows fighters, go through those channels, get whatever you can from this, because you are entitled to a chunk of this, and you shouldn't have to be fighting. I mean, this is one of those ridiculous arguments. Are you against fighters being paid? Buddy, if you paid the fighters properly in the first place, that wouldn't even be a point of contention. Anybody out there crying about boxers not getting paid, football players not getting paid, baseball players not getting paid, I'm sorry, that is such a ridiculous argument. all it does is expose a giant underlying issue with the sport that nobody really wants to talk about for any number of reasons. Am I against fighters being paid? It's ridiculous. The UFC is against fighters being paid. Let's be frank about that. If the UFC were in favor of fighters being paid, the fighters would have a collective bargaining agreement and they'd get 50% of the network fees that ESPN pays them. Because that's what every other athletic organization gets from every other incident of their sport being broadcast. You know how much the NFL pays Fox? Or Fox pays the NFL, excuse me. You know how much? A lot of money. You know where half of that money goes? To the players. You know how much ESPN pays the UFC? They pay the UFC a lot of money. You know how much of that goes to the fighters? None of it. So please, tell me how I'm the one against fighter pay when the UFC is actively screwing them out of money at every given turn. Take that and shove it. That is a non-starter of an argument. Absolutely non-starter. So, again, you've taken medical personnel away for a luxury item. Now, and here's the other thing about this. And, all right, I might catch, I don't know if I'm going to catch a ton of flack for this, but I'm going to say it. This event will not do well on pay-per-view. Because that's where it's supposed to be held. And there's a few reasons for it. Let's run down a few of them. Let's start with the big one. You lost the draw for this event. Khabib Nurmagomedov is a global superstar. That's just what he is. He draws traffic. He drives numbers. He is a star. He is a draw. There is no evidence about Tony Ferguson's drawing power at the pay-per-view level. There is no evidence about Justin Gaethje's drawing power at the pay-per-view level. Now, to the hardcore fan base, of course they're going to see this event. But this is an... Okay, there's a few things that we need to... If we're going to talk about the financial realities of this potentially, there's a few things we have to kind of talk about as well. So, we've lost the marquee drawing point to the biggest possible audience in Khabib, right? Tony, well-known in the hardcore audience, little bit less well-known to the casual audience. But, I'm prepared to acknowledge, not a tremendous amount of evidence, but Tony hasn't headlined a pay-per-view since, was his last headlining event when he fought Kevin Lee? I want to confirm this. Yeah, okay, so UFC 216, right? Headlined Kevin Lee, Tony Ferguson, interim title. That's the, I think, only pay-per-view he has main evented. That thing did a buy rate of 200,000. That's not good. That's really not good. I mean, the co-main event was Demetrius Johnson and Ray Borg, and I love DJ as much as any sane person should. I've said this as well, never much of a draw. Which is a shame, but... So, the only pay-per-view that he has headlined didn't exactly do all that well at the box office. In the interim, he's been on pay-per-view. He was on 229. He was the co-main event. So one of his most recent fights was the co-main event of essentially the biggest pay-per-view the UFC's ever done. And then he was just a featured bout on 238, which was Cejudo and Moraes as well as Shevchenko and I. And we don't have information on that one because that's after the UFC moved to ESPN Plus, and I don't think they've released... I'm going to have to double check. I do not believe that the specifics of that have been released publicly as of yet. But I have to imagine that wasn't exactly... I mean, that didn't exactly do gangbusters. when the UFC streaming stuff does great, they crow about it. When it doesn't, they don't. Again, they don't crow. They tend just not to answer the question, or to answer in very to give use such vague language that they're essentially not answering. So there's an open question about how well this is going to draw under ideal circumstances, right? World functions normally. Tony versus Justin as your main event of a pay-per-view. How's that going to do under ideal circumstances? Open question. If my hunch would be fair to middling, fair to low. Possibly I'm wrong about that, and I freely admit that. But again, just all I have right now is kind of the evidence at hand. Let's also talk about the fact that we're talking about financial realities here. Unemployment right now in the United States is somewhere between 13 and 15%. And over the next couple of weeks, that's probably going to go up. We're looking at unemployment numbers, that are kind of buttressing up against the Great Depression of the 1930s. Now, reasons for it being that way in this case are totally different. We're dealing with a global pandemic. But that doesn't change the fact that a lot of people are hurting, and you're going to throw this on pay-per-view behind a paywall, so you have to already have ESPN Plus for $5 a month or $6, and then you're going to plunk down $70 for this? I mean, I know there's a school of thought that being the only game in town has a lot of merit, and I'm just not convinced that it is. I mean, again, UFC Brasilia, granted, not the same quality of event, slightly different circumstances, but an event that had zero competition did the worst numbers of any event since the UFC partnered with ESPN. The WWE held WrestleMania on Friday and Saturday. Too big for one night. And I mean, I assume you guys don't actually care about my opinions on professional wrestling at this point. And fair enough, I'm not going to go into detail. If you're interested in that, you can check out some of the other shows on the 411 Podcasting Network. Larry Zonka has a fairly exhaustive breakdown along with Jeremy Lambert and was it Scott Slimmer that showed up? I don't know. Anyway, feel free to listen to Larry's thoughts. Larry is a professional wrestling coverage god. I don't know how he does it. But WrestleMania did not do the same type of traffic that previous iterations have. There wasn't a lot of the build-up, and let me be clear, I don't mean from WWE, I mean generally. And there's a lot of sporting coverage groups right now that are giving the WWE a bit of shine and a lot of coverage because they don't have anything else. But even that is not. I know a lot of people were like, "Yay, it was nice to see something like that. It was nice to see a degree of normalcy." I am not so sure. And I watched it, and I lost years of my life due to several of those matches just being boring and bad. Orton and Edge, I'm looking at you for taking approximately 2.5 eternities. But even that is not. It's not. The buzz isn't there. Not like normally. And I think there's a segment of the population that's going to see this, but there's a lot of people that just, I can't afford it. And we're talking something that's, 2 weeks out from where we are right now. More people are going to be hurting more by that point. I just don't understand what financial incentives the UFC is looking for here. I wish I knew the specifics. I wish I knew. But how... I don't imagine this event, given the totality of circumstance. Again, you've lost the big drawing portion of your main event. You've now got an event that will cater to, the hardcore fan base, but not a lot of else. On top of unemployment numbers that this country hasn't seen in, 90 some odd years. I mean, even the collapse of, '07 didn't necessarily see unemployment hit the numbers it's at right now. You're going to put on a $70 pay-per-view. I genuinely hope this event. I mean, look, I hate to root for it to fail in that sense because I don't want it to fail. I just don't think it's responsible to hold this event or any combat sports event right now under these conditions. It's really unclear to me that I think it was irresponsible of the WWE to hold WrestleMania. And they were able to tightly control a lot more of the production and a lot more of the aspects of this, of their event, than the UFC will be able to control. I don't think it's responsible. I don't think it should happen. And I hate to be that guy. I wanted to see Tony Khabib. I've wanted to see Tony Khabib for years. I want to see Tony and Gagey. I mean, come on. Those two maniacs, please hook that into my veins. But nothing happens in a vacuum. And I can't ignore the realities of the world we all live in. So if I'm going to talk about stuff like that, and if you think I'm being overly defeatist, then hey, you know what? Maybe I am. I have a slightly pessimistic worldview in general. I can acknowledge that. But and again, maybe something changes between now and then for the better. It would be essentially a miracle. But as things currently stand and as things are projected to continue, I don't think this should happen. I just don't. And if you want to be mad at me or say that I'm, rooting for it to fail, I can't control how you feel. Nor would I if I could. I can only call it like I see it. And that's how I see it right now. And I hope something changes. And either the UFC comes to its senses to one degree or another, or something miraculous happens and the world goes back to normal quickly. Both of those things would be nice from where I sit. I can't in good conscience support this event going forward, and maybe my support means nothing. Right? I'm one guy. Though if you listen to Dana White, I would be part of the media that is actively trying to sabotage his events. As though the majority of them aren't just treated as a PR machine, and anyone that isn't part of their PR machine is, blacklisted. As though MMA media has the pull to kill an event. That's ridiculous. Dana White's not saying where the event's going to take place because he does not know. They do not have a location. That's it. But it's easier to try and go into attack mode and throw up a smokescreen that the media will respond to in terms of defending themselves rather than actually address the issue of you being 2 weeks out, not having a venue, not having a location for what's supposed to be an interim world title fight at this point. Yeah. So that's UFC 249 as we currently understand it. And maybe things will change between now and then. I mean, things will change. Time will continue to progress, and something different will occur between now and then, but we'll see. We'll just take this, 1 week at a time and see what happens. But right now, I've said my piece on that, such as it is. All right, let's move on to. This should be fairly brief. The only other major news item of the last couple of weeks, Jon Jones. Jon Jones in trouble once again with the law. Jon was arrested a couple of weeks ago on aggravated DWI, possession of an open container, failure to have insurance, and reckless discharge of a firearm. Now, those were just the arresting charges. He since entered into a plea deal, I believe. The only thing he actually pled to, the other charges were dropped. He pled guilty to, I think, the DWI, the aggravated DWI. Served a brief period of house arrest and has his probationary period extended, or is on probation again. Jon Jones needs help, man. I mean, again, if you kind of set aside some of the previous incidents that he's had, or the fact that his personality rubs you the wrong way, think about this. Let me just paint you this picture. A man in his mid-30s, at some unholy hour of the morning, I can't remember exactly what time this was, I think sometime between 3 and 5 a.m., don't quote me on that, but late night, early morning, a father of a couple of children is found in the midst of a pandemic, drunk, on the streets of Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I mean, I think the body cam footage for this leaked again, because that always does. I don't know what's wrong with Jon. I don't know if it's purely alcoholism. I don't know if there's problems with his fiance, who at this point is probably his common-law wife. I mean, they've been engaged for, 5 years? Probably more. I don't know if there's problems at home. Or some combination of the two. But to the people in Jon's life, to whatever value my words have screaming into the void of the internet, he needs help. And I can only hope that the people around him will help him get it. Because, look, Jon got lucky. I mean, look, for anyone who might think that the punishment from a legal standpoint was a slap on the wrist, you're not wrong. But at the moment, a lot of prosecutors and a lot of criminal justice institutions are looking for reasons not to put people in jail or prison. For a very specific reason. Not only are those institutions overcrowded to begin with, most of them, the COVID-19 virus seems to be spreading through them like wildfire. So a lot of nonviolent offenses right now are, again, a lot of courts are trying to find ways to not throw people in jail, if at all possible. And so Jon got kind of lucky on that. I mean, if Jon had been arrested for those same circumstances in the course of, the world operating normally, I'm not saying he, doesn't get some kind of, isn't able to, his lawyers aren't able to get some kind of deal that is somewhat beneficial to him. I don't think he gets that at all. I mean, look, a lot of prisons and jails are like furloughing or, finding house arrest options or releasing a lot of their low-level non-violent offenders to try and deal with, the reality of COVID in the state while we have, these giant prison complexes. And I'm not about to go into a referendum on the American prison system, so I'm going to leave it at that. They are overcrowded. That is empirically accurate. Whatever you think the solution for that might be, I leave up to you as an individual, but they are overcrowded. And now a lot of people are getting sick. A lot of people will get sick. That's inevitable at this point, I think, for most of them. So, Yeah, again, Jon, little bit fortunate there. Little bit fortunate. Um, I don't know. I don't know what the UFC is going to do, if anything. I mean, I know some people have said that he should be stripped of the belt. I'm not sure I agree with that. And let me be clear about this. This is not me condoning Jon's behavior, but the UFC only punishes people when they are forced to via public pressure or when they find themselves in a circumstance where they can't pass the buck. The UFC stripped Jon of the title after his felony hit and run because there was serious uncertainty about Jon's immediate future. And Jon was out for a while. Given the logistics, I think that was the right call. We're not really at that point right now, so they don't really have a logistical internal reason. And law enforcement has already been at play. If the UFC strips Jon of his title in this instance, first of all, we already know that they, as a promotion, are just full of hypocrites. I mean, anybody remember, the serious concerns about Conor, the UFC just kind of blindly going ahead with Conor Khabib when there was the wake of felony accusations around Conor McGregor, and Dana's response was that cost Conor a lot of money, and the courts have had their say. The reality is the UFC has already set their precedent. And to anyone that might say, well, what about the UFC's code of conduct? Here's my question. What about it? I mean, seriously, what about it? The UFC has that on the books as a brief means of insurance against public scrutiny and backlash. They don't enforce it unless they really want to. You know why they don't enforce it unless they really want to? Because there's a very, very serious question about how much influence like that a business organization can impose onto independent contractors. The UFC really likes that fighters are independent contractors, not employees. They have shown historically to do everything in their power not to rock that boat. And if they start really trying to enforce a code of conduct onto the fighters, that's another thing that kind of muddies the water about where fighters stand on the classification system as far as independent contractor versus employee goes. And the UFC doesn't want that. So they're really only going to pull the code of conduct card, their behavior code, when they have plenty of other things they can hide behind, or there's enough public outcry surrounding a circumstance that they can feel justified in a bunch of other people not looking too closely at it. I mean, that's just kind of where that is. And so I don't imagine the UFC will strip him of the title. And given my desire for the UFC to be consistent about crap like this, I don't think they should, given their own internal precedent. But that's just me. And again, I know Jon rubs a lot of people the wrong way, and I don't blame anybody for being fed up with him. But I'm looking at this purely from a, UFC internal logic standpoint, even though that's something of a UFC and logic is a contradictory term. I fully expect Jon will be fighting probably by the end of the year. Against who and under what circumstances, I don't know, but I saw a fair number of people that were going, like, this is disgraceful conduct for a champion. Guys, this is combat sports. I could introduce you to a list of professional fighters with worse behavior than Jon Jones, who suffered zero promotional, not to say public backlash, but zero promotional backlash. Again, do I have to mention Floyd Mayweather? How about Mike Tyson? How about just some other prominent, fighters like Mayorga and some of the terrible things he said to Oscar De La Hoya? And the build-up to their fight. The list of people who behave badly who participate in combat sports professionally, whatever one you happen to choose, is a really, really long list. And I get that, people don't like Jon, and I don't blame you for not liking him. But Jon isn't the champion of model behavior. He's the champion of fighting in a cage. Is kind of my take on that. Now, if his behavior goes so far that he becomes a big enough detriment to society that he needs to be incarcerated, and let me be clear, I mean that purely from an actual standpoint, not your opinion. Because in your opinion, maybe we passed that point already, and I think there's a valid argument. In actuality, that's not where we are. If Jon actually goes to jail, then okay. He's not eligible to be champion, he should be stripped of the belt. Clear. If the guy just wants to mess up his life, I don't know what that has to do with his status as a champion of fighting. I just don't. And maybe that's an overly reductive point of view on my part, and maybe it's, not helpful and not conducive to Jon's personal well-being. And sure, I'll acknowledge that, man. I want Jon to get the help he needs, and if that means he has to step away from the sport, step away from the sport. If the man goes on sabbatical or retires, sure. He's not eligible to be champion. But I don't think you, and I mean to a lot of the people making these arguments, I don't think you want this sport, I don't think you would like the version of this sport where everyone's actions are policed to that level. I really don't. There's a reason, I can't remember where I heard this, but I think it's true. In combat sports generally, there's always room for, Captain America, the clean-cut good guy. But there's really only room for one. I just don't think people would like the version of MMA that would exist if the UFC actually were in a position to enforce that kind of code of conduct. I mean, they'd have to be fining every fighter basically after every press conference. In actuality, if they wanted to actually adhere to it. And they don't. They actually want to promote that kind of bad blood and trash talking. So they don't enforce it. And the number of people that would not stick around if the UFC were that sanitized is pretty big. And the UFC wants to appeal to the widest possible audience. That's just kind of the reality. You can go too far. You can absolutely turn people off with it. But Mike Tyson, at the height of his drawing power, was, thought of badly as a person. For good reason. In a lot of ways. But he was one of the bigger stars the sport's ever produced. Floyd Mayweather's the biggest attraction of boxing in the last, 5-7 years. And Floyd's never been a good guy, Not to say he's been a bad guy. He's a human being. There's good and bad in him, as with almost all people. But combat sports thrives on that kind of drama being made manifest. And I think, consequently, I tend to think if you're going to strip a champion, it needs to be for more reason than they got in. Again, Jon needs help, but if I'm the UFC, I don't know. Maybe the UFC wants to try and make a point about trying to help the athlete, and will try to force some kind of rehab stipulation onto him. I doubt it, but who knows? So I imagine Jon will be fighting again before the end of the year, or maybe first quarter of next year at the latest. Yeah, that's kind of where we are with that. So Jon got lucky, given the circumstance of the world, and obviously has some very good lawyers at a bare minimum. Okay, I think that's everything. Let me check Twitter one more time and see if something else crazy happened in the world of MMA. Well, no, I don't think anything else crazy has happened that I can see, so let's go ahead and just do some plugs and get on out of here. Alright, can you find me? Most recently, Mark Radulich and I did a couple of things. We did a review of The Gentleman on the Radulich and Broadcasting Network, and we did a series review for BoJack Horseman, the Netflix series. And had a lot of fun talking about both, so you can find my thoughts on both of those two properties in the Radulich and Broadcasting Network. Again, I mentioned already my Dominic Cruz study. I am working right now on one for Shogun, which I think I already mentioned. I don't think it'll come out this week. I think it'll come out next week. So be on the lookout for that. For you fans of Shogun, I will have a skill study and career retrospective look at who is, I believe, the third best light heavyweight of all time. I think he only falls behind Daniel Cormier and Jon Jones. So you can be on the lookout for that if you're so interested. And yeah, if more stuff breaks relative to MMA next week, we'll be back. If not, you know what? Yeah, we'll be back next week. That'll be Sunday the 12th. That will be, at a minimum, a preview for 249, such as it will be, I guess. We'll see what happens. Until next time, everybody, thank you all again so very much for listening. Thank you for sharing us with your friends. Thank you for sharing us with your enemies. I don't care who you share me with. We'll be back next week. Until then, as always, stay safe out there and continue to be well, be safe, and behave.